Hello everybody, and greetings from Dublin. My name is Niall Roche, and I am a WASH, Water Sanitation and Hygiene Specialist, but I also work part-time here at the Centre for Global Health in the Trinity College Dublin. I'm going to periodically take the webcam on and off so you can see some of the words. Okay. So many thanks for this opportunity to speak at the 3rd Annual International Remote Conference of the Beyond Sciences Initiative. So this presentation is made in the context of global health. My background is in environmental health. I deal to a large extent with WASH, water sanitation and hygiene, within wider public global health. Some of this might be related to air pollution issues, for example, or also vector control. These are other aspects of my work. However, since 2008 or thereabouts, I've recognized the centrality of dealing with climate change, as illustrated by this quote that I've picked up. Climate change is an environmental health hazard of unprecedented scale. So as an environmental health professional, I have to consider climate change as a major aspect of my work. Climate change has been defined as the defining challenge of the 21st century. When he was Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon said this in 2000. And the Lancet in 2009 said that climate change is the biggest global threat to health in the 21st century. So anybody working in global health needs to be addressing climate change, or at least be aware of how it is impacting on their work. So what do we know about climate change? We know that it's already warm. It's getting warmer. Our planet is getting warmer. We are already 1 degree centigrade warmer than average temperatures before, and we'll reach a minimum of 1.5 degrees centigrade. If we continue as business as usual, we could reach temperatures in excess of 4 to 5 degrees centigrade by the end of this century. We also know that climate change is anthropogenic, or it is human-induced climate change. We are the cause of it. Concentrations of greenhouse gas emissions are well over 400 parts per million, compared to 280 parts per million in pre-industrial times. We're sure 97% of scientists agree that climate change is a reality, and it is us that is responsible. And this is stated in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 5th Assessment Report of 2014. It will also be known as AR5. And as you can see there on the right hand side, you can see the cover of Climate Change 2014, the synthesis report, which in itself is made up of 3 separate reports. Working Group 1 report was on the physical science base, Working Group 2 and Working Group 3 reports, which were on the issues of mitigation and adaptation. We also know that climate change is bad. It's bad for us as human beings. For example, global grain yields have declined by 10% in the context of climate change. But on the good side, we also know that we can fix it. We have it within our power. We need to keep 80% of current fossil fuel reserves in the ground. And we also know that we have the technology. We have the technology available to us to stop climate change. What we need really is the political will, and that's perhaps where the challenge lies. Okay, so where does much of this come from? Well, the basis for my understanding of it comes from the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change of 1992. This was made at the Rio Summit in the same year. And Article 4F of the Framework Convention on Climate Change states the view that we must minimize the adverse effects of climate change on the economy, on public health, and on the quality of the environment. Now, perhaps in previous years, the emphasis was on the economy and on the quality of the environment, and not a great deal of attention on public health. But thankfully now there seems to be a great deal more attention placed on the issue of public health. So what are the effects of climate change on health? They're both direct and indirect. The biggest effects are probably indirect, as stated by this first quotation. The indirect effects of climate change on water security, food security, and extreme climatic events are likely to have the biggest effect on global health. If you are focused in the area of nutrition or food security, you would probably be alarmed to see that undernutrition is identified as the largest health impact of climate change in the 21st century. So if you're working in that area of global health, then you are presumably also trying to address the issue of climate change. Otherwise, you are fighting an uphill battle. So this is a graphic representation of the effects of climate change on health. It is perhaps not so helpful because it's quite difficult to read, and within the time frame that we have here, you probably need to go back to it later on. But you can see the production of greenhouse gas emissions at the top, and this is having lots of different effects. On the left, you see the impact on those greenhouse gases, particularly carbon dioxide, being absorbed by our oceans, leading to ocean acidification, which is impacting on fisheries. On the right-hand side, you can see that the production of greenhouse gas emissions produces pollutants, particularly particulates of 2.5 and 10 microns, and the impact of that on cardiovascular disease and also respiratory disease, which we'll make reference to later on. We also have raised average and extreme temperatures. We'll make some reference to heat stress events. Rainfall patterns also impacting on agriculture and food security. We have sea level rises, which might be impacting on the displacement of people from coastal communities, and saltwater intrusion of freshwater sources, making water less available. And then we have the extreme weather events. If you're from the Caribbean or the southeast of the United States, you might be familiar with the extreme weather events such as hurricanes and the direct implications of those. Okay, just a couple of quotations here taken from the latest report, the Lancet Countdown, Tracking Progress on Health and Climate Change. This was released on the 30th of October, just this in 2017. On average, 5.3% fall in productivity for rural labour estimated globally since 2000 as a result of rising temperatures. So people physically cannot work in these rising temperatures. I personally have been in countries like Pakistan where temperatures exceed 50 degrees centigrade in certain parts of the country at certain times of the year. In 2016, this effectively took more than 920,000 people globally out of the workforce. In terms of food production, even if the people are available to work, we have a 6% decline in global wheat yields and a 10% fall in rice seeds for each additional 1 degree rise in global temperature. Okay. This graphic probably illustrates it a little bit easier in terms of the different potential health effects of climate change. And not just potential, but the existing health effects of climate change. So we have heat stress events, a direct effect of climate change, leading to cardiovascular failure, particularly in older people who are most vulnerable in a heat stress event situation. We have extreme weather events, which is probably well known in relation to climate change. The injuries associated with that, the fatalities, as well as the destruction of housing, the displacement, and so forth. Air pollution, as we mentioned, the impact of air pollution, the particulates, not only contributing to asthma and cardiovascular disease, but a major contributor to the development of pneumonia, particularly in children under 5, where pneumonia is the biggest single killer of children under the age of 5, outside of the neonatal period. It also contributes to allergies. An area that is of particular interest to me is the issue of vector-borne diseases. Malaria, dengue fever, Rift Valley fever, for example, chikungunya. These are all vector-borne diseases that are climate sensitive. And while malaria deaths may be going down, perhaps because of the Global Fund in the last number of years, you can expect malaria to be found in locations where you would not have expected to find it before because of the rising temperatures. Dengue fever, for example, was in, I think, 9 countries in 1970 and now can be found in 50 countries, and half the world's population are now at risk of dengue fever. And climate change has a role to play in terms of that risk. Waterborne diseases such as diarrheal diseases, and the most kind of one that strikes fear into our hearts is the issue of cholera, which has killed over 2,000 people in Yemen at the moment. Killed over 8,000 people, I think, in Haiti following the earthquake in 2010. The biggest indirect effect of climate change being on water and food security or food supply here, malnutrition, diarrhea, again being linked to the waterborne diseases, but if you're malnourished you're susceptible to diarrhea, if you have diarrhea you're susceptible to malnutrition, so there's a cyclical relationship going on there. And then mental health issues, anxiety, despair, depression, post-traumatic stress, and that is in some way linked to the last one there listed as environmental refugees. So people might be forced to migrate because their livelihood cannot be maintained in their environment, and there might be conflict as a result of competition over declining resources. Okay, so that all sounds quite depressing, doesn't it? But what is going on to try and address these threats at a global level? Well, we agreed in Paris, we the international community agreed in Paris in December 2015 at the COP21, or the Conference of the Parties. So the UN Framework Convention of Climate Change agrees to have these climate change negotiations every year on an annual basis at the end of November, beginning of December every year. COP23 just finished in Bonn there in November. But we agreed in Paris. We had failed actually in Copenhagen in 2009 to get agreement, but in Paris we got agreement to limit global warming to 2 degrees centigrade and pursue efforts to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees centigrade. We also set up money, a fund. Every health system needs money to function effectively and to adapt to climate change. So there's a $100 billion fund established from developed countries to help those emerging and developing countries to adapt to climate change, but also to help them to initiate initiatives to mitigate their own greenhouse gas emissions, even though they historically have not contributed much to the damage that has been caused so far. And so those who are most vulnerable to climate change are the ones who have done the least to contribute to it. We are aiming for zero emissions between 2030 and 2050, although this is not legally binding. And we have I suppose the target is to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 80%, 80% against our 1990 levels by 2050. So we're looking for a dramatic shift in our behaviours in terms of the production of greenhouse gas emissions and the use of fossil fuels. And then countries will also develop their own NDCs, or intended national determined contributions, in terms of what we will do to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And the key thing about Paris is that those contributions will be ratcheted up in order to achieve our target by 2050 of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by 80% and limiting global warming, hopefully, to 1.5 degrees at most, or 2 degrees at the very worst. Okay. So climate change is tackled, broadly speaking, in two ways. One is through mitigation, and the other one is through adaptation. Now, for me, working in developing countries, I'm probably most familiar with the issue of adaptation. And much of the language that we use in the developing countries is around building resilience or disaster risk reduction, DRR for short. My last trip to Pakistan was working for an international NGO who were supporting capacity building efforts of local NGOs who in turn were hoping to work on building the resilience of their communities the next time they faced a hazard such as a flood in Pakistan, or, as was already happening, a drought in the Somali region of Ethiopia. But health systems also need to adapt. We mentioned malaria already. Health systems need to be maybe modelling the future. Where can you expect to see malaria in the future? And the health system adapting maybe to have the right human resources who are available to diagnose malaria in areas that they wouldn't have been expecting to see it before, and having the drugs to do the treatment and promoting maybe bed nets, for example. But health systems also need to make a contribution in terms of mitigating their own greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, and I know the NHS, the National Health Service in the UK, have been making good progress in terms of reducing their greenhouse gas emissions despite increases in activity. But there are also tremendous opportunities for health benefit associated with climate change. So again, the Lancet series of November 2009 referred to the health benefits, or the health co-benefits, associated with addressing climate change. I've clustered the first three together because they are all associated with air quality. household energy emissions, urban land transport, low carbon electricity generation. And the fourth one then I've separated out on its own in relation to agriculture and food. So here's a couple of pictures taken of various air pollution. One I took a picture myself in Liberia, and the other one I took off the web from India. So in terms of air pollution, well, in terms of the environment, I think a quarter, the WHO in 2016 estimated 1/4 of all global deaths are associated with poor air quality, or associated with environmental determinants. Yeah, so the environment contributes to 1/4 of all deaths. There's my picture back again, just to see that I'm still here. So they estimated in 2012 that there are 7 million deaths, 1 in every 8 globally, as a result of exposure to air pollution. Okay, and 3.7 million of those deaths are from ambient air pollution in the broader environment, as you can see on the right-hand side, through poor urban transport, and 4.3 million from household air pollution. So half the world's population are dependent on what we call biomass fuels, and those who are living in poverty are at the bottom of what we call the energy ladder, depending on the dirtiest biomass fuels, such as crop waste and dung, and maybe timber sticks that you see on this 3-stone stove in Liberia. In Africa alone, household air pollution accounts for 581,000 deaths on an annual basis. This exceeds the number of deaths that are currently estimated from malaria. And yet what global attention is put on addressing household air pollution? If you are focused on the issue of gender, or if you have a particular interest in child protection, for example, or child health, you can argue that there should be more attention to this, because women and children are those who are most exposed from household air pollution. And I would argue also that if we can't choose the air that we breathe, it's not a behavioral choice to choose to breathe this type of air, and that we have a right to clean air as well as the broader right to a clean environment. I think this is one area of global health that is just not getting enough attention. And when you look at the scale of the burden of disease associated with air pollution, it's quite unbelievable that it doesn't get more attention. So if you want to look specific in terms of the opportunities around agriculture and food, just to highlight that agriculture and food production themselves account for a significant proportion of the greenhouse gas emissions that are being produced, 10 to 12% globally, maybe a little bit more. Here in Ireland, oddly enough, 33% of our own greenhouse gas emissions come from the agriculture sector, which I think partly explains why we are one of the poorest, if not the worst performing country in Europe with regard to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And we are way off target to meet our obligations, and we'll be fined by the European Union for not meeting those obligations. Increased meat consumption leads to changes in land use patterns. So forests are cut down and there's more livestock. So the forests, which act as a carbon sink or sequester carbon, are not there anymore. And the livestock themselves are producing greenhouse gases, primarily methane, which has greater warming potential than carbon dioxide. In relation to non-communicable diseases, which I'll make reference to in the next slide, heart disease, diabetes, some cancers, and other diseases associated with overnutrition, high-fat diets, and reduced exercise are already increasing in some countries. And then if I can remove my webcam again. Reducing livestock production not only reduces greenhouse gases, but also impacts on cardiovascular health in particular. And that's illustrated from the burden of disease data that I have here from the Global Burden of Disease study of 2010, and I don't think the figures are a whole lot different in more recent years. Non-communicable diseases account for 65.5% of deaths of the total disease burden. And the trend is upwards. Communicable diseases are generally going down, but the trend in relation to non-communicable diseases is going up. And if we continue to invest in livestock and we continue to invest in those high-fat diets, then the burden from non-communicable diseases is only going to increase, even in developing countries. Okay, I like this particular quote, because what's good for climate is good for health. Yeah, so whatever we do in health, in terms of mitigation, as well as adaptation, will ultimately bring about a health benefit. Yeah, so it's a win-win situation. So it makes sense to invest in addressing climate change, because it will bring about a health benefit. If you're more interested in this issue, I'm giving us a link there to the proceedings of a climate change and health conference that was held here at the National University of Ireland in Galway on the 22nd of September, in which I was partly involved in organising. So, as I mentioned, we mentioned the Conference of the Parties in Paris in 2015, COP21, and what was agreed. Interestingly enough, there was a parallel event on health at the last COP23 in Bonn in Germany, just there in November 2017. We had the 5th Global Climate and Health Summit to discuss health actions for the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So the number tells you that health perhaps hasn't been discussed too often up to now in the context of climate change, but now there's a degree of attention. I don't know the outcomes of those discussions, but the issues that were discussed included impacts and opportunities in relation to cities and regions, and I imagine that was to do with the fact that we have this urban heat island effect, so global temperatures going up, heat stress events have a big impact in urban areas in particular, and more people living in urban areas, more people are likely to be at risk. But there are also opportunities in terms of making our cities smart. What are we doing in terms of ramping up our mitigation activities within the sector of health? And then also, how is the health sector preparing for the issue of climate change, and how are we maybe prepared for potential extreme weather events or other problems associated with climate change? And then what leadership are we providing in terms of this area? Just make some brief reference to the Sustainable Development Goals. Now at a global level, we have the Sustainable Development Goals that followed on from the Millennium Development Goals, which ended in 2015. We now have 17 global goals to achieve by 2030, and I think 169 targets within those 17 goals. So climate change is littered throughout the Sustainable Development Goals, but SDG 13 is specifically related to climate change, and it says that we must take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. And all of us have a responsibility to integrate, or in other words, maybe mainstream, climate change measures into our national policies, strategies, and planning. And I would also say also into our ways of working and also into our human resource practices as well, that we must integrate climate change measures into everything that we do. I like this particular statement because I think it rounds up everything nicely. Climate resilience, we talked about resilience and disaster risk reduction and adaptation for health, as well as healthy mitigation strategies, must be woven into our global health work, or integrated, mainstreamed, whatever language you want to use, and health must be central to our global framework for tackling climate change. That is my final statement. I hope you found the presentation useful in terms of the context of global health. What are the threats associated with climate change, but also to recognize that there is an opportunity there and that you can work in either an adaptation or you can work maybe to advocate for mitigation aspects also. So thank you.